Everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Christina. If you are new here, I am a naturopath, herbalist, life coach, as well as carnivore, and this is where I share about my own personal journey with carnivore, as well as tips and tricks and dietary information, health information, alternative health, all of that type of stuff. And today I'm going to be talking about insulin. Now, I'm going to be talking about insulin for a whole bunch of reasons, and one of which is because it is the master hormone when it comes to our bodies. So insulin has a whole bunch of different roles within our body, and we tend to only look at it in response to glucose. So the way that our current teaching tends to lend itself is that we only think about insulin when we have got a problem with our glucose. So if you have been in the space of carnivore, if you've been in the space of keto, low carb, high fat, diabetes, all of that type of stuff, polycystic ovarian syndrome, you might have already started to think about insulin. I personally have had to think about insulin for quite some time now because 21 years ago, I had my first baby and I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes within that pregnancy. Now, my father had had diabetes prior to that. And so I had a really little bit of knowledge about diabetes, but it didn't really land at home for me until I got that diagnosis with gestational diabetes. And at that point was when I needed to make some decisions about my own health. And not only my own health, but the health of my unborn baby. And what I did was I started to go on a journey of discovery because being the person that I am, as soon as I got that diagnosis, I needed to learn everything that there possibly was to learn about diabetes. And of course, if you learn about diabetes, you can learn about insulin. And so went to my university because I was working at the local university at the time. I went into the library and I got out all the medical books that I could find on diabetes and gestational diabetes. And so I spent some time learning and gathering information and just started to develop my understanding around these things. And that's usually how most people come along the term insulin. So it's how most people come along it in the sense of like they've got diabetes, they've got a friend who's got diabetes, they've got somebody else who's got diabetes, or maybe they have to look after somebody who's got diabetes. That's usually how most people start to come along, like find out about insulin, start to think about it. So most people have had a similar experience in the sense of like, they've learned about it that way. Now, of course, if you've done medical school, if you've done nursing, you've done naturopathy, all of those types of nutritional studies, biochemistry, you're going to maybe touch on it. And again, it generally is touched on in terms of glucose. So most people only start to think about insulin once they've got a problem with glucose or they're talking about it from a medical perspective around glucose, because that's one of its major roles. One of the major roles of insulin is to match the glucose that's in the system. So glucose comes in, we eat it or we make it because we do both. And then our insulin from our pancreas, so our pancreas will have a signal and then it will release, based on the signal that it's received, enough insulin to try and match the glucose that's in the system. And when it's doing this process, its goal is to tightly manage how much glucose is actually in our bloodstream. And so it does that by opening some doors in the muscles and shepherding glucose into those muscles and planting it there. Now, there's a whole bunch of different things else that it does, but that's the major way that we speak about it. So when we're talking about it from a blood glucose perspective, our glucose has risen. We usually are thinking that we don't have enough insulin. Or really what's happening is that we actually don't have enough insulin now, or we're not producing, or we can't produce enough insulin now to match the amount of glucose that we're generally bringing into our bodies. Now, I say generally because we also make glucose. So if you're not eating glucose or carbohydrates, then your body will actually make them as well. So there's another little side element to think about. Now, for me, when I'm thinking about insulin, I think about it on a whole bunch of different levels. One of which is that it is involved in a whole bunch of things that happen in our body. And I'm gonna share some of those with you. So insulin, of course, does that role of opening the doors for glucose to go into the cells and do that function. It's also a survival mechanism. So having insulin and then a little bit of insulin resistance has over the period of our time as humans actually help to keep us alive, because those people who are able to jump into insulin resistance are the people that are able to put down padding over winter or for winter. So, in summer, they're able to gain weight. And so that when in winter, that food is no longer around, they're able to utilize and access that weight. And that's kind of how it's meant to happen. And it's a survival mechanism. It's designed to help us thrive or survive through the winter, through harsh climates, through times when we don't have food available to us. It's designed to do that. So there's a survival mechanism involved in that. It does, of course, blood sugar regulation. It helps us to store excess glucose so that we've got it for times when we don't have it. But we live in a world where we rarely get times where we don't have it. It does the process of balancing things like our macronutrients. It helps to regulate energy. It helps to build muscles. It also has a role in fluid management within our body. So if we've got some issues of excess fluid, insulin has a little bit of a role in that. It enhances memory or decreases memory and learning. So depending on whether you've got too much going on or whether you've got not enough going on, will depend on and really we want to be in the place of homeostasis, not too much, not too little. We want to be in that place of homeostasis. In that place of homeostasis, that's when we've got advanced learning, we've got advanced memory, we've got great recall, all of that type of stuff. So in the case of somebody with dementia, what we're now starting to discover is that dementia and Alzheimer's are closely linked to type 2, or they're calling it type 3 diabetes, which is diabetes in the brain, sugar in the brain. And so therefore, the insulin has not been able to match the amount of carbohydrates that they're bringing in, and that's having an impact on the brain. And so we're losing memory and learning in that scenario. So it has a role to play there. It has a role to play in bone formation. So if you've got osteoporosis, for example, then it's really important to have your fasting insulin checked to see if the insulin is actually playing a role there. It acts on our central nervous system. So if you've got nervous system issues, if you're suffering from depression, anxiety, stress, have an inability to self-regulate, or have a nervous system that is kind of fried, then, fasting insulin has an important role there, and it's worth actually looking at it. So insulin has a role. It's worth testing fasting insulin. It has some roles within our blood system. So within our vascular system, it has some roles with our heart. It has some roles with the transportation of things within our blood system as well. But one of the big things that insulin has a role in that we don't generally talk about is when it comes to female hormone production. So when we've got high levels of insulin, that high levels of insulin in our ovaries encourages our ovaries to create more testosterone. So that's when we're going to see women who have got hair around their upper lip, around their jaw, maybe, around the base of their neck, etc. They're getting hair where women don't usually get hair. That's often a sign, not always, but it can be a sign that they've got more testosterone happening. And so if their ovaries are using that insulin to produce more testosterone, then they are not making, or their balance of estrogen and progesterone is likely to be out as well. The other thing is when it comes to that high insulin is that it alters something that's called sex binding hormone, or sex hormone binding globulin. And so it alters that. And that hormone does exactly what it is meant to do, is that it binds with sex hormones. Well, that globulin does what its name says. It binds with hormones. So we can have too much of it, which means that we're binding with too much of our sex hormones, so therefore they're not effective for us. We can have too little of it, and therefore we have, excess estrogen, and we have too much estrogen, and so on. We have problems from that perspective as well. So it has a whole bunch of different roles that it plays within our body. And a big one around that is this feeling of creating safety. And I talk about this from this perspective because insulin does the process of insulating our bodies. It insulates our bodies. It is the thing that regulates how much insulation we have, how much excess fat we have, how much we don't have. And so I like to look at it from the physical level of there's this physical thing that's happening. But the other place I like to look at it is from the emotional level. And I want to give you a scenario because it's something that I hear often enough. It's something that I've been through myself, that it's really worth mentioning. So let's say, for example, you do a diet that is working, where you lose some fat, right? You're losing some weight and it's working really well. And then suddenly you start to really struggle to manage that diet, to keep doing it. Like it's nothing major has actually changed, for example, but you just are finding it harder to keep up with it. Like maybe it was really easy to start with, but now it's becoming harder. And one of the things about that is there's this physical element going on, like your insulin might actually be too high, and we have to work on actually helping to get that down. But the other is emotionally. And this is the part where I like to come in a little bit more, and that is because predominantly, it doesn't mean I don't work with males. I absolutely do. So if you're a male and you're watching this and you're going, I would like to work with you, totally come and see me. But the vast majority of people that I work with are female. And there are these patterns of self-sabotage that we often see. And a lot of that comes from this place of feeling unsafe. And when we feel unsafe in whatever way that is, whether it's emotionally, physically, spiritually, etc., we signal to our bodies to do things in preparation for unsafeness. So, for example, you've done a restrictive diet. You've taken out, like I did this, for example, I did HCG, where we were only having 500 calories a day. I was taking some homeopathic drops. They were designed to help release the fat cells, etc. And I did lose significant amounts of weight. But I didn't do any of the emotional work along with that. With that weight loss, I did no emotional work. I did no journaling. I did nothing to actually look at why did I get that way in the first place, because I maybe had just bought into it's the whole you eat too much and move too less, or don't move enough scenario, because I was very new at some of this stuff then. And so I maybe bought into a part of that, but also hadn't spent the time delving and looking into the emotional effects. And really the outcomes that we receive, if we were to backtrack it, and we learn this in coaching, which is the be, do, have model. The be, do, have model is, what do I want to have? So for example, it might be the weight loss. So what do I need to do to get the weight loss? And then who do I need to be to take the action of the do to receive the results of the have? The be, do, have model. Who do I need to be to do what I need to do to have what I want to have? And we often spend most of our time in the have model, the have space, where this is what I want to have. And so we try and then go to the do bit and we negate the be bit. So, this is what I want to have. Okay, so I know I need to take some actions in order to have that. Like I might need to eat less and move more. So I take that action. But I don't move to the be part of that, which is, who do I need to be in order to take that action? And the other part of that is that action even the right action to be taking? And so that is something that's the space that I work in, is okay, this is what we want to achieve, but in order to have that, A, we've got to look at it from a long-term process. B, what would be the most appropriate action to take in order to be able to have that? And what are the things that what is the mindset stuff that I need to do in order to, who do I need to be? What messages do I need to be talking to myself with? How do I need to speak to myself? What things do I need to do in order to be able to do the actions and continue to do the actions in order to get the results? And this is where I think about insulin. Because if we are just doing to try and get the having, what will happen is that at some point, when we haven't looked at the foundations of why did we do the things in the first place? How did we get here in the first place? What will happen is that we'll create a level of either white knuckling it, where we're trying really hard to make it happen, or we quit. And when we quit, we not only gain back what we lost, we gain back extra. And a big part of that is this feeling of safety. So if we're out in the wild and there's food is starting to become short, our insulin rises, everything that we eat. So our thyroid also slows down, and everything we eat, we hold on to, so that when we get to that phase where there is no food anymore, we slowly ration it out with the goal of getting ourselves through winter. And then once we start eating again, those hormones start to change and they start to come down and they come back into a more balanced state. And so that happens in nature to keep us alive. But emotionally, there is a physical element that happens as well. So there's this physical and emotional space that happens. What happens on a physical plane happens on an emotional plane as well. And so from the emotional plane, for a lot of women, the reason that they got to where they were in the first place of carrying excess weight often has something to do with feeling unsafe, whether it be unsafe in their bodies, whether it be unsafe in their homes or their jobs or their lifestyle, or unsafe in how they speak to themselves or what they think about themselves or what they believe they're allowed to have. There is often a level of unsafety, and that unsafety triggers these hormones internally to start kicking off. And so if we're just losing the weight, what we're telling our bodies are, depending on how we did it, if we like just dropped calories, for example, we're telling our bodies that there's no food around. So the insulin starts to go up, thyroid starts to slow down, and the body starts to hold on to weight. And it'll hold on to as much as it possibly can for as long as it possibly can. And then the moment you start eating again, it's going to suck it all in and suck and hold on to it. And if we've been doing this yo-yo dieting cycle of actually doing those things over and over and over again, it's learned this story and this history about how to do that and what to do in order to keep you safe. But from the emotional perspective, if we're losing weight, and part of the reason that we gained the weight in the first place has to do with an emotional trigger, whether it be feeling unseen in our lives, and so I'm going to be so big that you can't ignore me, whether it be that they've had sexual abuse or unwanted sexual attention, I'm going to buffer myself and or try and make myself unappealing to the male gaze or whatever gaze that was creating that feeling of unsafeness, whether it be just that they were witnessed, like it could be catcalling down at school, it could be actually sexual assault, it could be a whole bunch of different things. The key that I'm trying to give you there is that it doesn't necessarily always equal something really big and significant. Sometimes I was walking down the hallway at school one day and this boy called out something and I felt unsafe. That's all that's it could or uncomfortable, or I felt really uncomfortable in my body, and then I was like trying to hide my body. I didn't want people to see it, and so then we hide our body with excess weight, right? And so these are some of the things that can be happening in the background, and if we don't spend time resolving that, if we don't spend time looking at that, then what will happen is this yo-yo dieting sort of thing happens over and over again. So even with carnivore, right? You could be doing carnivore, fantastic results, getting amazing results, losing weight, etc., working brilliantly. But then you get to a point where now it's really hard. Like weight's not budging, I'm still eating the same way, or I'm finding it difficult to stay on track. I find it difficult when the things that have not had any hold over me for ages, like chocolate, for example, now suddenly start to, and we can go off in this whole sort of like spiral where we give in a little bit and then that little bit is like a mile. Give an inch, take a mile. That whole scenario takes place. But it starts from this place of having not actually resolved why did you insulate your body in the first place? Like, why did that happen? And sometimes it's happened from physical trauma of like having food removed from you. Sometimes it's emotional trauma as well as physical trauma. There's a whole bunch of things that can actually happen. And again, it doesn't have to be really big and massive. It can be a buildup of small little things that have led you there or feel small. And so this is one of the spaces that I work with when I'm working with clients. It's one of the spaces that I work with myself when I'm unpacking and resolving these situations. Now, let me give you an example from my own life. One of the things that I have struggled to do for myself is actually move beyond a certain number on the scale. And when it comes to that number, if I reflect back, that number was the number that I weighed when I came home from hospital after being on life support. So if you're new and you don't know the story, my last baby, who is now 11, when she was born, I had a pregnancy condition called placenta previa. My placenta was at the base of the uterus, and placenta percreta. So my placenta had also eaten through my uterus. So my previous C-section scar had eaten through that, had attached to my bladder and into my major blood supply. So of course that uterus can't, that placenta can't just fall off when the baby is born, because it's actually attached and interwoven into my actual body. And so that was a life-threatening condition that left me on life support for like 7 days. And then it took me months to regain my strength and be able to like have enough strength to walk and look after myself and toilet and do all the fun stuff that we take for granted. And so when I came home from hospital, I weighed a certain amount, which probably was the lightest that I'd weighed as an adult. Yeah, as a proper adult, it was probably the lightest that I'd ever weighed. Now, even with carnivore, I've had a bit of a struggle when I would come towards that weight, and I would come back, gain a bit, go back, gain a bit, come back, gain a bit. And then every so often I might like tiptoe over the edge of that weight loss. And so when it comes to that, one of the things that there's a couple of things that are actually in that, but one of which is that was a time where I was completely unsafe in my life. Like my surgeon said it was like he was holding me here by my ankles, keeping me earthside. Like that's how dire the situation was. If enough people hadn't donated blood, so I had 180 something units of blood. It was about 180 units of blood. If 180 people with O negative blood had not donated within 3 weeks, then I wouldn't have had enough blood to survive. And so there's all these things that had to go the way that they went in order for me to survive. And so my body went through massive amounts of trauma during that experience, which of course left it feeling completely unsafe. And so I have an internal message that, I'm working through in regards to giving my body safety and making it feel safe and making it feel heard and holding it and doing things like tapping, etc., as I move towards that number. Because I know that there is an internal messaging that that number isn't safe. And so that is one element. Now, another element of that is um, prior to that situation happening, I had been doing the GAPS diet with my family, and I was going beautifully. Like weight loss was working really well. Other things in my body, things I didn't even know I had problems with, were doing well, and I was recovering and feeling great. And I was at my most healthiest at that point. And that was when I fell pregnant with that last baby. And so my brain had also connected this term health with death. Because when I was at my most healthiest, that is when I had a pregnancy that caused me to die. So my heart stopped beating several times. They had to revive me a couple of times during that delivery, and it was over a period of 7 days, but they had to keep taking me to theatre and so on. And so, I had several situations where, my heart stopped beating. It just couldn't do it anymore. And they were able to revive me, thankfully, and bring me back. So essentially, the messaging my body took, though, was that I died. And I died when I was at my most healthy. And so it naturally, like when I sit back and I think about it, I go, yes, I can understand, body, that you keep the score and your scoreboard says when you are healthy, you die. And so there's this internal messaging there around that. And that was something that I've had to learn and unpack more and start to get to that place of asking the question, is it ultimately the truth? Like, did I go through that life-threatening pregnancy because I was at my most healthiest? No, it was a combination of things. Like, that that pregnancy happened because A, the baby probably implanted fairly low in the uterus. B, I'd had previous C-sections, so the scarring was already there. And so the placenta was able to eat through that scarring. Like there's a whole bunch of things that played into that scenario actually taking place. It wasn't that I was healthy or at my most healthiest that actually happened. It happened for a whole bunch of different reasons. And so one of the things that I work with when I'm working with my clients around these particular topics is one, we've got to find what the things are. We've got to pull on the threads and start to find what they actually are. What is the message? What is the internal voice that's there? What is the rule that was created? What meaning did you give some of the events in your life that then created some of the rules that are blocking you and stopping you from moving forward? And then, is that ultimately the truth? Because very often it's not. Majority of the time, I would say probably 100% of the time, it's not ultimately the truth. And so, one, is it ultimately the truth? And two, can we change it? Can we alter it in some way? Can we change that message? Now, I'll give you another example. I was talking about this with one of my clients the other day. That sometimes we want to completely remove the message. We want to remove it. We want to get rid of it. We want to destroy it, etc. And we want to replace it with something good, something that's loving, kind, generous, etc. And sometimes we just want to change the meaning or redefine what it is. So, as a kid, one of the things that my mum would call me often was lazy. So I was lazy, I was a lazy person, etc., etc. Even to the point, like after we'd had one of our babies, I hadn't had a lot of sleep and my kitchen was a mess. It was a disaster. We'd just been eating, like, when you have a baby and you're just living, you're just trying to survive. You don't always get to to do all the jobs. And so my kitchen was messy. And she came to my house and she apologized to my husband for raising a lazy daughter. So it was a significant term and word that was used throughout my life. Now, when I came across that message, so for example, when we have a message like that, like I am lazy, we also then have some opposite rules that go with it. Like if, for example, if I'm lazy, lazy people can't have X, Y, and Z. They can't have good stuff. They can't have clean homes. They can't have etc., etc. Like we have rules that go along with if I'm lazy, what are the rules around the things that I can't have and the things that I do have? So there's these rules that go with these messages. And so we've got to look at like what are those things? The other part of this is redefining what lazy means. And for me, in the situation, it's been such a significant word that was used through my life that I needed to take the power out of it. And one of the ways that I took the power out of that term was to redefine what lazy means and start to think like, what is my definition of lazy? And my definition was vastly different to my mum's. Like she put a lot of time and energy and a lot of focus into the house being as clean as possible. Whereas for me, that was far less important. I wanted to spend more time with my kids. I wanted to spend more time having and doing life with my family rather than cleaning up after my family. And so, we had different focuses, and that's totally okay. But the other part of that was realizing that that term lazy was used to describe how I would think harder or I would think cleverer, smarter, not harder. So I would think about what is the best way to do this versus I'm just going to do it and use a whole bunch of energy to do it. I'm going to think about how do we use the least amount of energy in order to be able to achieve this same result. That was my definition of lazy. Or the other part of that was like that definition of like, what is lazy for one person is not lazy for another person because they've got different goals. And so I deconstructed the word and deconstructed the meaning into things that took the power out of that word for me and made me be able to challenge it. And so again, this is some of the work that we do when it comes to why am I not moving forward when it comes to weight loss? Why am I struggling to lose weight? Or if I'm gaining weight, what might be some of the underlying stuff that's going on there? So, for example, when I have clients that are gaining weight, often if they've had adrenal fatigue or they've had significant stresses in their life, then there will be a period of carnivore where they will gain weight, where their weight has to kind of go up. And part of that is because they have to overeat now to fill up some nutritional stores that have been completely depleted. But the other part of that is that when they went through the stress, the likelihood is that they actually didn't deal with the stress, they were surviving the stress. And so when they're surviving the stress, they're not focusing on like, what is the messaging that I'm getting from this? What am I learning from this? And they're not taking, like, they're not necessarily got the time or capacity in that moment in time to like really deep dive and delve into it and do the inner work around that type of stuff. It sort of hangs around. And so that hanging around, when we start to feed them and nourishing them properly, it's like, now it's time to start dealing with it. Now it's time to start like spending some time focusing on those things, those internal messages that continue the insulin response, that continue to spike those things for us, which are giving that message of, I'm unsafe. So now we need to increase insulin and we need to increase resistance to that insulin so that we gain weight. This is something to think about if you are struggling with that. We've got to look at the interpersonal stuff because remember, insulin is the key hormone when it comes to losing or gaining weight, and it is the primary insulator for our bodies. And so if we are insulating our bodies, the question is, why are we insulating our bodies? And that's where some of the gold can be found, because that's where the inner healing takes place, and then everything else can start to fall into place. This is why I'm running the Lion's Heart in January, so that we can together do the dietary stuff, but also do the interpersonal work stuff. And I've just looked at my calendar for January and gone, this is really interesting because there's 5 Fridays in January. So instead of the 4 coaching sessions, we're actually going to have 5 group coachings where we talk about this type of stuff. And so we're going to deep dive into some exercises. I'm going to do some exercises with you. I'm going to do a little bit of coaching with you so that we can start to unpack and work through and define some of these things in order to start shifting the, why am I insulating my body? Why do I have to, like, when I'm losing that weight, now I'm starting to feel unsafe because I'm removing the insulation and I'm feeling vulnerable. Why do I have to quickly put it back on? And starting to change that story within our heads. So if you want to come and join me, feel free to. I'll put the link in the comments below. Otherwise, start thinking about that question of like, why do I need to insulate my body? What am I feeling unsafe about? What would it be like if, like, what would my life be like if I lost the weight? Like, what are the fears that come up around that? Do I feel unsafe when other people are noticing that I'm losing weight? Do I feel unsafe? Do I feel scared? Do I feel worried? Is there some anxiety about that? Like, I was sharing again the other day that I literally had one client once that for her, she kept doing this yo-yo struggle because she had a fear around if she lost too much weight, she would have to buy a new wardrobe. Now, most of us would go, hallelujah, fantastic. I would love to buy a new wardrobe. What a great problem to have. But for her, the story came back to when she was a child, she grew really fast and her parents didn't have much money. And so they would get angry that she outgrew her clothes because they didn't have much money to buy new clothes, but they had to dress their child. And so there was a hurt or a wounding there for her about getting a new wardrobe, getting new clothes. And so she always tried to dress in hand-me-downs and op shops and those types of things and spend as little on possible for her own clothing as possible because of this story that she'd received as a child. So then now as an adult, when she's losing weight and she's then going to have to buy all these new clothes, there's this story that comes up that says, you're not valuable enough. You're not worthy enough. You are a problem. You're going to cause financial distress for our family, etc., etc. Like there's all this stuff that comes up around this really simple thing of I'm going to have to buy more clothes. And so all of these are elements about healing the heart. And that for me is the whole purpose of doing things like carnivore, is to take all the food stuff and move that to the side. So what we're left with is all the emotional gunk, so that we can heal that, so that we can wholly move forward into our lives, so that we can move forward as a whole being that's healing our hearts versus continue this struggle of going back and forth, and continuing to tell ourselves, see, I suck. See, I'm crap at this. See, you're not worth it. I told you you weren't. All of that messaging. time to put it on the shelf. So if you're keen to start 2025 with me doing this work, come join me in the Lion's Heart. I'd love to see you there. Otherwise, start doing this work yourself. Start asking questions. Get curious. Instead of judging what you're doing, get curious and ask the questions. Why do I do that? How is that serving me? Like in some way it's serving me. How is it serving me? What do I need to pad myself from? Like what are the hurts, the pains, the shames, etc. that I'm insulating myself from? Why am I hiding my body under excess weight and padding? It's time to come out of those. That's it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them below. Remember, like and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to see you here again in the future. And if you want to come and join me for Lion's Heart, come do that. All right, bye for now. Have an amazing day. See you later.